we speak about God's presence is concealed in this existence. He's not obvious. And even when he was obvious, as it says, the first time God went public in the most public way, when he brought the 10 plagues on Egypt, which seemingly it couldn't be denied that it was the hand of God. The 10 plagues, yet the Egyptians, initially, that they were the masters of sorcery, they attributed what was happening, which was supernatural, not to this being who transcends existence and wills existence, but rather it was the manipulations of the nether forces which allowed these things to happen. That's how the sorcerers processed initially the plagues. And they said to Moshe, who are you trying to fool? Don't you realize we're the masters of sorcery? But when it came to the third plague of lice, where the dust turned to lice, they said, this is the hand of God. Why? So the Midrash tells us, because the sorcerers understand that sorcery cannot affect something which is less than the size of a barley pearl. So since a louse is less, clearly this is not rooted in sorcery. But yet, the Egyptians, it wasn't enough for them to understand differently. And it went from bad to worse until all Egypt was reduced to rubble. And many things were happening. And yet, they still didn't understand. It's like a person says, I understand what you're saying, but I understand clearly. You couldn't have said it better, but if you understand it that well, and you've never heard such a level of clarity, what's the but? What's the interference? The answer is because there's a reality that we still are we, and we have to deal with our own feelings and our own needs. That feeling and need that we have for ourselves automatically is a distraction that you can't internalize fully what you're experiencing, what you're seeing. I'll give you an example. The Rambam writes that a Jew has a Torah obligation to maintain his health. Why? Because a human being is endowed with intelligence, and to be able to maximize on one's faculty of intelligence, you need focus. One should not have distraction. And the words of Rambam, you can only have a healthy mind if you have a healthy body. Why? Because if your mind is distracted with pains and aches due to failing health, you no longer have that full focus. Although I hear what you're saying, I understand what you're saying, but to be able to internalize something, if you have any distraction, it may be subconscious, it may be subliminal, it may be something you feel. I hear, but that's the but. Because if you would fully internalize the reality of what you hear, there's no buts. There's no ifs or buts. It is. If I tell you not to put your hand in the fire, you know in the fire means you burnt. You will be burnt. And I explain to you how the fire will consume and destroy your hand. You're not putting your hand in that fire for any reason if you want to remain whole. Because you know there's no distraction. That's a reality. You don't have a desire to put your hand in the fire. Now, everything has an upside and a downside. Is it worth my while to take a chance? If the desire is enough, automatically that ups the ante. It pays to take a chance. What about if there's no chance that you're not going to be hurt? If you want to forfeit your life or forfeit a function, you do it, which is foolishness. Most people are not that foolish. But you have to appreciate sufficiently the reality of what you're dealing with to understand that it's not worth it. And to appreciate that you need the focus. And you need a degree of spiritualization within the person to be able to internalize the reality and the fact that whatever that is beneficial, or whatever that is destructive. And if you can't fully grasp it Well, as we say in the, you don't get it. Certain people, they make the mistake over and over again. Usually, you're supposed to learn from the mistake. Some people, they don't learn from their mistakes. It's not because they're somehow mentally incompetent. That's not the reason. It's because they're foolish. What's the foolishness? Because they believe that although they failed once, they're not going to fail again. The desire for whatever that is so overwhelming, they delude themselves and they believe it's not going to repeat itself. But it does repeat itself. And the person goes back for more and more. How many times could you go back and make the same mistake over? But people are so bound up in that foolishness and that delusionary because they want it so badly. Therefore, they can't internalize the reality and appreciate the level of what their failing is for that reason. But that's the reality of human beings. That's the way God created us. And that's the struggle of life. So the physicality of the world, although there are many indicators to be able to pick up on things and see, due to our own conflicts, although we may understand or not understand whatsoever because we don't want to understand. Some people don't even have a capacity to understand. They're so far from wanting to know what truth is because they don't believe that purpose of life is truth. It's only to up the ante and keep your head in that feed bag and to live a life of hedonism. That's all that makes a difference. That person is in the dark. And he lives in the dark. His function may be 100%. He has 20/20 vision. He's a marksman, but you're always missing the mark. Because what you're aiming for is not what life's all about. But that's called concealment. The world is concealment. It's not illuminated. It's not pulsating with God's presence. If you stood at Sinai, where God lowered heaven to earth, and the mountain billowed smoke and fire, and there were sounds, thunder, which was totally all-consuming, and you heard the voice of God. When you heard that, anything in the physical was totally negated because God's presence was so overwhelming. There were no distractions. It was almost impossible to deny the truth. But in life, where God's presence is not as obvious, firstly, we don't look for the truth. We're not interested in the truth. And even when we're confronted with the truth, at best, it's for the moment, and then we somehow are able to hoodwink ourselves and to sweep it under the carpet, as if we never ever noticed it or experienced it. That's the reality of a human being, and that's why God created the world. And that's why life is such a challenge. During the first temple period, which the miracles weren't of the dimension of the 10 plagues, a Jew would go into the temple, he was able to witness 10 miracles every single day. But yet, the temple was destroyed. Why was it destroyed? After 410 years. Because the Jews engaged in behavior which was unacceptable. They violated the 3 cardinal sins. They have no interest in Torah, which is the antidote to give illumination and to override the physical system, to transcend the system, to dictate that system. It's interesting. A person who's bipolar has this chemical imbalance. If that person doesn't take his medication, the person has a surge of energy at certain levels. You can't believe that person is the same person as you knew before. That's how out of control the behavior is. Uncontrollable behavior. You give that person the correct dose of medication that he needs, and you create that balance, the person recedes back away from that uncontrollable behavior person, energy level, and now the person has a balance. Within that balance, you could talk to that person. The person processes things rationally, different reality. So what did the medication do? When you infuse that person with that medication, it creates a balance. And within that balance, the person could behave and think and process things rationally. God gave us a medication. It's called an antidote. It's called Torah. When you study it, and you study it with the right intent and understand its value, it affects you, it touches you, it gives you a way to see things within a rational context, to appreciate what is and to ward off and deflect what's not. And you have an appreciation why things are not in your best interest. But you understand, you got to take the medication. And just as the bipolar person, the main problem is he doesn't take his medication. Identically, we as physical beings, being inclined to satisfy the beast, we don't engage sufficiently in taking that antidote and engaging that antidote. Because that antidote is illumination that gives us a grasp and control over our lives. Like that medication gives that bipolar person a control over his life to create the balance that the person sees things for what they are within human context. But why does the medication affect the person in such a way? Because within its makeup, it has that ability. It's a chemical which gives that creates that balance. The essence of a person is a soul. Soul is a dimension of holiness and spirituality, of illumination, nothing compared to it. But when it's embedded in the body, in the physicality of the body, a person has no sense of the soul. How do you activate that soul, that it's start pulsating? You have senses that go beyond the physicality. At least minimally to be able to gain an interest, a curiosity, an inquisitiveness to pursue or to evaluate things within a different realm of evaluation. That you have to accept the Torah as being that. Give you an example. Person needs that medication, and he could go to the greatest pharmacopsychiatrist, and he prescribes it. If you don't take it, it means nothing. And if you take it, you have to take the right dosage. And you have to take it as prescribed, as often as it has to be taken. Then we have a good chance it'll work. And then the trials. We don't always get the dosage exactly right. You have to take enough of it. You can't take too much of it. Of course, the person becomes non-functional. You don't want the person to become a zombie by taking too much of this medication. And that's the struggle. And the person feels the reason why these people don't want to take the medication, to speak to any of them, is because they don't feel themselves, their energy level, they feel being suppressed, and therefore they don't want to take it. We as human beings, we have overwhelming levels of desires. That beast is pulsating with us. Whatever it is, whether it's material acquisition, whether it's pleasure at various levels, it's something which drives us. Somehow you have to rein in on that. The power of that drive is overwhelming. What about if you take that power and channel it and invest it in something else? And when you invest it there, you have a value return, and you're able to internalize that value. Because when you do that, the physicality of the body becomes spiritualized, as we've been discussing, and within spiritualization, that minimizes the animal within us. We become less animal. It's more than being tamed. You tame an animal. First, the animal is tamed. You take control of that overwhelming energy and force. And over time, by investing in it, in spirituality, which is the value and purpose of Torah and mitzvos, it's the conditioning within a spiritual realm that the effect is that even the physicality of the body and the emotion and the energies become spiritualized. And therefore, they don't haunt us. They don't overwhelm us. Now, it's interesting. People are bipolar. Fortunately, I know some people. There were times they wanted to go out of a window on the 30th floor, and they had to hold them back. We're talking about very intelligent people because they didn't take the medication. They destroyed the room they were in somebody's house, and then they opened the window. They were ready to jump. That's how insane they were. And this person once came to my office and spoke to me. I couldn't believe it was the same person. And to a degree, I feared that he could hurt me. And he had a very close relationship with me. Without the medication, he was insane. He was mad, madly insane to that degree. We're, as human beings, we're madly insane. We have a predilection to be madly insane. Ego, pompousness, I believe, I am, I control, I dictate. There's nothing which I can't have if I could have it, and I want it. It's interesting. We read in Pirkei Avos that you should pray for the welfare of government, because if not for the welfare of government, people would literally be predators to the degree they'd eat one another alive. Could you imagine? As we say, as much as we're out of control, but if we understand the cost factor, it's going to cost us our lives. That crazy went out. And that's government. There's law and order. If there's law and order, people behave themselves. Because the consequence of violating the law, that brings a person to a level of reality, they appreciate how wrong it is. Because it wouldn't be that wrong. There wouldn't be such of a consequence called classic as criminal behavior. It wouldn't have that level of punishment, incarceration, or worse than that, or death penalty. But if there's no law and order, and there is no government, what do you have? It's called chaos. It's called anarchy. It's called madness. It's called survival of the fittest. Everybody's in that mode. It's disastrous. Society cannot exist. It has to be destroyed and start all over again. And maybe then people will learn from their behavior, from their lessons, because they shirked and they threw off the yoke of control. That was the end result. But by then it may be too late, because there's no hope to continue. But that's the physicality of the world. Everything is concealed. The soul, everything's obvious. But when it's embedded in that body, it's like you don't know you have a soul. And I mentioned, the only reason why we know we have a soul is because at Sinai, God openly communicated to every Jew. Every Jew openly communicated in a wake state. And God says, this is your reality. You're a composite of physical and spiritual. And there's nothing in existence comparable to your soul. The intensity and dimension of your soul is greater than the greatest angel. That became fact. And the way you deal with this struggle, I'm giving you a Torah. This is God telling you this to us. You observe the mitzvos, the 365 negative commandments, the 248 positive commandments, and you study the Torah, and you do it qualitatively, then you'll be spiritualized. The soul will be activated, and the soul will have the upper hand to the degree it'll spiritualize the physicality of the earthiness of your body. And if not, you're going off a cliff. You're going to take on an unstable level, and you'll behave as if you'll be more dangerous than the greatest predator animal, because you can have an intellect and you'll be driven by that desire, and therefore you'll come up with ingenious ways to be able to bring about the fulfillment of that desire, as wrong as an extreme as it may be. I mentioned a person who's ahead of the game. You're born to a parent where your parents start conditioning you as a child to speak a certain way, assume certain beliefs, to act a certain way. Although you're not obligated as a minor in any commandment, nevertheless, the conditioning process innately has the ability to tame to a degree and to spiritualize to a degree all the physicality and passions of that child. And it's already invested in a certain arena, which is called spirituality. We're not saying that person will have challenges. We all have challenges, regardless of how special our background was, Jewishly speaking. But the one who doesn't have it, and you're raised that you believe might is right, and money is power, and power is God, that person is starting off, what we say, on the left foot with an Achilles heel with some kind of genetic malfunction. It's an understatement of where that person's at. But again, life is all predestined in terms of opportunities. God will not hold anybody accountable unless they were on the spectrum of life. There are indicators and signs that there are opportunities and you're able to catch yourself. A person's in free fall and he's able to grab onto a limb of a tree and catch himself. He doesn't fall to his death. And the limbs present themselves multiple times that you grab on. Every time he passes, he just lets it go. And he falls and hits the bottom and he's splattered. And he's a mass of nothing. The person's a fool. He had so many opportunities to save himself from hitting the bottom, he could have caught himself. Although the branch will go up and down many times before it stabilizes. But at least now you can look down and see what could have happened and didn't happen. And you could say many things. I was lucky I caught onto the branch. Or maybe, something. It's unheard of that it should present itself. You have stories, people fall off a roof and they fall on an awning of a canopy of a building, a child. And if that canopy didn't break to fall with the child would have been killed. Now, why did it happen? They say, well, the statistic is it hardly ever happens. So why did it happen this one time? Well, this kid was lucky. The parents were lucky. You could process it, interpret it in many ways, but it's an opportunity. Maybe you should go discuss it with others. Maybe they'll give you an understanding what it is. A person has a pain and he goes to the doctor and the doctor diagnoses at the beginning of a very serious problem. And the doctor says, you're lucky you came now, because if you would have let it go for a while, God forbid, it could have been terminal. But because we're able to nip it in the bud now, you're going to recover. Other person ignores the pain continuously, but the pain is persisting, getting worse. Why don't you come sooner? He had enough indicators. Life is no different. God provides enough indicators in the person's life that you have to pick up on it. You want to gloss over it? That's your choice. For whatever reason, why a person wants to gloss over it. You even have people speaking to you about it. And you believe you know better because your arrogance, your ego doesn't allow you to come down from your high horse, to entertain or consider even for a moment what that position is. But that's the reality of life. There used to be an expression, try it, you may like it. You don't hear that anymore. At least try it. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it has value. Rabbi, I have no interest, period. That's the response. I used to say to people, maybe you'd like to study an hour a month. Rabbi, if you knew how busy I was, you'd realize I don't have an hour to give you. Say, what about a half an hour a month? Rabbi, I don't have 5 minutes in the month to give you. What does that say? There's no such thing. A person doesn't have 5 minutes. The answer is, I'm not interested. But God forbid that same man who doesn't have an hour or 2 hours in a month, he's diagnosed with melanoma and he has to go to Sloan Kettering for treatment. Also, where did you come up with all this time? Now you have hours. You got to sit there hooked up with all kinds of toxic chemicals being pumped into your body to deal with your problem. All of a sudden you have time. I never knew I had that time. God forbid. All of a sudden the man makes time. So when you're healthy and not where you should be, and somebody makes you an offer, I have no time. No time means you have no interest, but you know you're a Jew. I always say, when we want to bring Jews back to Judaism, it's not proselytizing. We're not proselytizing anybody. I want to share with you what's rightfully yours. And when I'm talking, the person knows historically, the Jewish people have a code of law. We're the people of the book. You know something? Not interested in that book. That book, I don't see any value or any advantage by having it. I got my MBA, I got my Wharton degree, I got my relationships in Wall Street, I have this, I have that, whatever you have. That's what's important. Okay, that's your choice. But again, you have awareness to some degree, and the person doesn't have awareness. There are enough indicators in life that you could have picked up on it. You know, it's very interesting. You know, a Jew has an obligation that if you see a fellow Jew going astray, you have an obligation to try to inform him of what's rightfully his and maybe to prevent him from harm. It's a positive commandment. In many situations, two people meet and you see the person being disconnected, assimilated, and you're able to enter into conversation with that person, which may give some degree of interest in his heritage, and you don't. So his opportunity of life is you meeting him, and you choose to pass on it, and you don't take advantage to enter into the conversation to that person. That conversation make a difference in that person's life, in his eternity. What is the level of culpability to the person who did not enter into the conversation? You cost him his life. Here, God presents you with an opportunity, one of a kind, that you can make a difference. And I choose, I'm too preoccupied. I choose not to meddle in other people's lives. The person who could have made a difference, didn't make a difference, he has very great level of liability because you could have made the difference. Every one of us, even to discuss cuisine, person says, you know something, you ever hear of hamantashen? He says, no, I've heard of something, an Italian word which describes some kind of food, which you can't even pronounce that word. I said, no, we have a thing called hamantashen. He says, what is that? He says, we have a holiday. And you start to explain to him a holiday, what happened, which was almost equivalent of a Holocaust, and this and that, and to commemorate that. Person has some degree of interest. Tells you he's not interested, you're not interested, but at least you made the attempt. And there are many ways, your points of entry, that you could be able to discuss things with a person to give him some level of interest. A person behaves in a very special way. And the way people today in our society behave, sometimes it's a rare commodity seeing a person behave in this refined manner. And you do behave that way. And because of that, you noticed, and you notice in a positive way, not in a negative way. That person notices you positively, and it's identified, has to do with your Jewishness, that's called a Kiddush Hashem. You representing a Jew in a positive profile, which people take notice and take away as positive, that's something very positive. It's influential. If you don't notice, you can't have an effect. If you noticed, the notice can have a negative effect, have a positive effect. Therefore, if you can have a positive effect, that's your responsibility to have a positive effect.